I'm just letting you know, first of all, that this is being recorded for people who cannot make it but are still interested. Can I ask that people ensure that their microphones are muted? You don't have to show your face. You can also stop your video, but I do know from experience it's nice when doing a presentation to be able to see smiling faces looking back. So if you are comfortable with having your video on, then I do encourage you to do so. And today I've been lucky enough to introduce to people who I work particularly with one of them because we're both at the University of Otago very closely with, and the other closely with because we're part of the wider research support network of librarians in New Zealand. And they've come to talk to you about an ongoing CONZUL project, which is to understand the state of open access in Aotearoa New Zealand. So our presenters are Jessica Howie. Jessica is from she's a research services librarian from the University of Waikato. And because they wouldn't provide me with their own bio, I had to stalk them on LinkedIn. And Jess describes herself as a scholar, as an open access advocate, and she says that scholarly communication is her happy place. And Richard White, who's the manager of copyright and open access at the University of Otago. He is a higher education professional with particular expertise in open access and copyright in the digital age. And you've all come to listen to them, not to me. So I will pass over in a second. I just want to let you know that the presenters are happy to take questions during the presentation. I will be monitoring the chat. So if you wish to, you can type in, but I'm sure they would be also fine with verbal questions from the floor as well for those who are happy and confident about using their mic. So thank you, and I pass it over to Richard and Jessica.
Kia ora, Siobhan, thanks for that. I'm just going to share my screen, won't be a second. We're using Canva for this. This is the first time I've presented using Canva, so bear with us and do let us know if anything goes awry. So thanks so much for having us. It's really nice to present this work to people within our sector who we know it'll be close to your hearts as well as ours. So this is all comes back to a project that was set up by CONZUL back in 2019. So just a moment to acknowledge CONZUL for the foresight that they had in setting this up. And in particular to Anne Scott at the University of Canterbury and Kim Tyree at Auckland University of Technology, who are sponsors for this. And also to acknowledge Moira Fraser as well, who drove this project in its very early days. So this was a project to figure out how we're doing in New Zealand, how much of our stuff is open, and actually a whole bunch of other things as well. So the way we did that was with a script written by Bruce White at Massey University, who's now retired but continues to help us very generously. And it's a multiple API study. So basically what the script does is it grabs a chunk of digital object identifiers, or DOIs, and it goes around a bunch of APIs and picks up various information from various sources. Is a thing open? How has it been made open? Who's the corresponding author? How has it been cited? How much might it have cost to be made open? And could it be made open without a payment? So I can't really overstate how much richness there is in this data. We've just barely scraped the surface of it for the purposes of this project. And there's a whole bunch more analysis possible. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to have a look at the data, which is openly available. We'll be making the slides available, and also there's a slide at the end with all of the important URLs, so you don't need to copy anything down desperately. So the upside of this, like I say, is that you can chuck any bunch of DOIs at the software and it will do the same for you. The downside to that is that we are only looking at things with DOIs and things that are in Web of Science or Scopus. So we want to be clear about acknowledging that that there are limitations to that it's not capturing everything. Also, just to acknowledge, we're talking about 3 years worth of data now. We started the project in 2019, but we're looking at publications from 2017, 2018, and 2019. So each year we've looked 2 years prior. And the reason for that is to give some time for citations to accumulate. And it also has the bonus of allowing embargoes to have passed. I also want to acknowledge that we're looking specifically at work out of New Zealand universities. So there's also wonderful research coming out of our CRIs and other places. So we're not capturing all of that. But again, this is a script that can handle any DOIs. So we were excited this year because this was our 3rd year we can start to look at trends. So to dig into that a little bit deeper, the first and most important thing, and this is going to be no surprise to anybody here, is that when research is open, it can achieve more. So it's got access for a whole bunch of people that would otherwise hit a paywall. And I don't think that anyone has ever not hit a paywall. The thing is, a lot of people say when we're talking about open access, well, so what if the public don't read it? You know, what do the public care about a particular academic article? But I would argue that's invalid on the basis of a whole range of things. First and foremost, who hasn't been to the doctor and come out with a diagnosis, come home to Google it, and run into a whole bunch of paywalls? And the other thing is, if people can't read it, wherever they are, whether they're public, policymakers, citizens, whatever, if they can't read it, they can't act on it. So there's also a facet to this. This is about knowledge mobilization and the relationship between research and the public. And I think it's also getting more important because as the stretch comes on in terms of budgetary pressure on libraries, subscriptions are going to get scarcer. So even if there's someone sitting in a university now who could pick up a piece of research and cite it, that might not be the case into the future because these subscriptions are going to start to wane. There's also an equity access to this. So, you know, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here that knowledge should be shared, not hoarded, not sold. And we have to acknowledge that paywalls privilege the privileged, and in this particular environment that we've got at the moment, allow misinformation to flourish. So we've got all of these things, as well as what the researchers themselves will really care about, which is a citation advantage. And we also found, using Altmetrics data, that open access publications were 5 times more likely to receive media attention. So to dig into that just a little bit more, we have to be careful when we're talking about citation advantage to acknowledge that correlation is not causation, which is something we're hearing a lot at the moment with debates over vaccines and what have you. And also that we're using averages here. So averages are a fickle metric that can be warped by outliers. For what it's worth, when we looked at citation advantage in our academic paper, we were challenged on this, and we looked at citation data through a number of different lenses. The relationship was stronger and weaker, you know, some sort of facets that we looked at it, but it was always there. So just to go back and explain a little bit about these types of citation, because this is one thing we were interested in. It was no surprise to us that things that were open were cited more, but, you know, how is it open and which type of open got things more cited? So hybrid is when we're talking about things that are published in a journal which publishes both open and closed material. Bronze are things that have been made open at the publisher's discretion. So these are things that, you know, might be made open temporarily, kind of on a free basis, or all those things that were made open over COVID, they will show up as bronze. Green are things that have been put, that have been self-archived or put into a repository somewhere. Gold is when somebody has paid an APC in a fully open journal. And diamond is where a journal's where it's fully open and there hasn't been payment of an APC. So this is quite often our local journals, society journals, things that are published in-house. And also to acknowledge here that we don't have great representation of these things because often they don't show up in places like Scopus and Web of Science. So I just want to take a moment here before I hand over to Richard and point out the kind of elephant in the room, which is that hybrid is cited a lot more than just about anything else on this chart. And that was true for the myriad of ways we sliced and diced the citation data. So hybrid journals are often the most prestigious journals that publishers have. And we know that publishers really like the hybrid model because they, charge both for subscriptions and for APCs. So it makes sense that things would be cited more here, not just because they're the more prestigious journals, but also possibly because researchers are much more likely to put their stuff there. For what it's worth, we think there might be potential in the data to dig into that question around author bias and what part that plays, but that's something we haven't looked at yet. So at this point, I'm going to hand on to Richard, who's going to talk a little bit about how much was actually open.
Thanks, Jess, and kia ora, everyone. Actually, just go back a slide to the one you're on. I just wanted to add one thing about this. Firstly, this is just the 2019 figures in this one slide we're showing here. It's not the change over time. And we did see some difference in the different years. So we should just mention that that's 2019, that particular set of figures we're looking at there. But the other thing I just want to draw people's attention to is green versus closed. So remember, green and closed are essentially the same things, except that the green ones is where there's been either some automated process or a conscious decision by the author to put a copy of the closed article in a repository and thereby making it open. So those two are a really good one to compare. Hybrid, as you've said, there's lots of reasons why it's doing well. There's massive marketing behind some of those journals. They get a lot of attention. Someone may have paid for that fee because they knew this was a good piece of research and they wanted it to be publicly available. But green versus closed is a really good one to keep an eye on because they're really the same papers, but where one has been made open and one has not. And you can see there's a clear advantage to green in those. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so you can go on to the next one. Yeah. All right, so having talked about the impact, this is then showing us how much of our research, again, it's DOI only stuff, is actually open or closed. So this one you can see does track across the 3 years of outputs that we looked at. So you've got 2017, 18, and 19 in those three columns. You see it's not massively changed. And this is quite an interesting stat because there's plenty of people we've shown this figure to, to say, well, 40% or 44% of our stuff is open, and they go, oh, that's not as bad as I thought, which is terrible, really, when you think about it. More than half of our research is not available for free to anyone who doesn't have a subscription to it or who isn't willing to pay that thing. So the reason we started with the impact stuff that Jess has been talking about so far is, to sort of emphasize what we're missing out on when you look at that proportion there. So it's not a lot of change over the 3 years in those figures. And it's, remember, this is the national picture, so it's for the 8 universities. Individual universities fluctuate slightly on either side of these figures. And then the last thing to say about this slide before I move on is when we say in 2019, 44% of our research was free to access in some form, we've used the broadest possible definition of open. So, and we use one of the key APIs that Jess was talking about at the start is the Unpaywall Api, which they provide this for free that you can tell whether a paper is freely available. But they use a very broad definition of freely available as well. It can be just something that's free, but it doesn't necessarily have an open access license. So you can go and read it, but you can't necessarily actually copy it, give it to your students in a class. You can't necessarily archive it or whatever you want to do with it. You can't reuse it. You can't build on it. You can't put it in slides necessarily. It's just there to read. It hasn't got an open access license on it. So if we talk about the proportion of our research that is actually definitely free and openly licensed at the time of publication, so when the version of record was published, it was open. It's actually only about half of these figures that we're seeing here. We haven't put the specific numbers in here, but I think it was 22% for 2019 was published in a journal, open access with an open access license. You know, if you think about what Jess was saying about the bronze is something that can be turned on or off by publishers. It can be open for a time and then made closed again. And green, repository-based research, wasn't open at the time of publication. It's open now, but wasn't necessarily. There may have been an embargo period before it was made open. Okay, all right, next slide, please, Jess. Okay, so then breaking down those overall numbers, again, we've got each of the 3 years here in these 3 columns. So we've got our slightly complicated and slightly controversial about what these mean, these color coding things. You can see the closed at the bottom is that, 56 or whatever it happens to be percent for each of the years. The green, the gold, the hybrid, the bronze, and the diamond. So this is the proportion of each of them in the total. So we were interested to see whether this is really changing. You can see there isn't a massive amount of change over time, over the 3 years we've been looking at this. So the close proportion is staying the same. The amount of repository-based stuff is pretty much the same. It's around the sort of 10% mark. The only one I'd really say has changed a bit is that the gold, which is the, it's the gold colored one in the sort of middle there, that has increased a bit. And although it doesn't look a massive amount on this graphical presentation of it here, it's increased from 14% of the total amount of research in 2017 to 17% in 2019, which actually represents 485 publications across the sector. So that's 485 more publications that will have incurred an APC of some form, an article processing charge of some form. So although it doesn't look massive, it is worth noting, I think. We've seen hybrid go up a little bit more too. Now I've got a question in the chat. I'll read this out, shall I? Do you think New Zealand should establish a policy, which I believe exists in Australia, where government-funded research must be made open access? Yes, there was a typo there. Jess, you're going to talk about funders in a sec, so perhaps if you just save that one up for when you get onto the funders. In fact, that's the next slide, is it? No, it's 2 slides away. Anyway, I'm handing over to you now for the next one, I think.
Yeah, thanks. So the thing is, other countries are way better at this than us. Even Australia is beating us at this. That's the most important part. These figures are from the Koki project. I think there was a talk on just before this, which I missed, unfortunately. Fantastic Koki project and the Koki dashboard, which provide amazing data on a slightly different methodological basis than we do. But this is just to show that yeah, we are not doing great in this regard. These numbers aren't random, and they reflect the different national approaches that have been taken. So in the UK, for example, I think things have to be open to be considered under their research evaluation processes. Indonesia at 83% publish very heavily, kind of publish in-house. We did look at this over time. We talked about our slightly slow progress. And the thing is, with only a couple of exceptions, other countries aren't moving particularly fast either. But one other glaring thing we did see was that other countries are using green open access much more effectively than us, even those that are investing heavily in the gold open access model to get. So even the ones that aren't relying on green open access are using their repositories and leveraging their repositories better than we are. So to come back to the funder thing, you would think that work that's publicly funded, and I know that in a way everything that comes out of a university is publicly funded, but I'm referring to things that come from grants from our large funders such as EMB would be more open, and it is, but not much. And once again, other countries are making a better job at this. So research funded by Australian top funders is 70% to our 52%, even though their open access rate is only 2% higher than ours. And the UK is up at 91. So I don't want to go too much into this, but there is work being done around funders at the moment, which is really exciting for those of us working on this project. So that work's being undertaken by an intern in the office of the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, who's been working with funders on what might be done in this space. And we're really excited to see what comes out of that. But I think what we need to consider out of all of this kind of international lens is just what New Zealand is missing out on by so much of our research not being visible to the rest of the world, when the rest of the world is doing much better at this. So to hand back to Richard.
So let's talk about money. Just mentioned earlier that our methodology is slightly different to some of the other ones, but so when we're talking about money and payment of APCs, we're looking at two types of journal, right? Gold, and we've used gold in the sense of paid OA as opposed to diamond, which is free OA, and hybrid. So both these two incur article processing charges. And the other key thing to note here about our methodology is that as a way of estimating what's likely to have been paid, we looked at who the corresponding author was on each publication and used that. Some other methodologies we've seen, I think, have sort of been just saying, well, there were 5 authors and we're just going to divvy it up 5 times, and it depends which institution you're at. But that's typically not how stuff is paid. It's usually paid by one institution, and that's the corresponding author is the best proxy we have for that. So these are just estimates, but given that our data set is in the region of 12 to 13,000 publications, you're looking at a pretty good size of data set to be making reasonable guesses about what's going on. Okay, so to look at the graph here, again, you've got the 3 years, 17, 18, and 19 that we're looking at. And I mentioned earlier on one of the earlier slides that gold had gone up by 485 publications in terms of the volume of publications. So you can see that's clearly reflected in the amount that we're estimating is being paid over time. Hybrid's gone up a little bit, but actually took a dip for some reason, a small dip in that 18 to 19 period. And so we've got the amounts there. So you're looking at around $4 million in 2019, and it's clearly gone up from what we were paying in 2017. And overall, over the 3 years, we're looking at $9 million. Now, it sounds like a lot of money. To put it in context, it's not a massive amount of money compared to what we're paying through subscriptions and other, fees that we pay to publishers for access to digital resources. The most recent public number I know around that was provided by CONZUL to the Copyright Act review submission process a couple of years ago, and that was $68.5 million paid for electronic resource access by the 8 New Zealand university libraries in 2017. So that figure's a bit out of date now, really, but it'll be, in that ballpark. So $68.5 million in 1 year is a lot compared to $4 million in 1 year. But APCs, as we can see, are on the increase, and they become important when we're trying to understand the overall picture of what our institutions are paying to publishers, because APCs are really completely hidden from our libraries, except in a couple of instances. There's a couple of universities who have APC funds that researchers can apply to, but they're certainly not covering all of the APCs that are being paid by those universities. But for the most part, this is money that's being paid directly by researchers out of their research funding or out of departmental budgets directly to the publishers. So it becomes very important now. Lots of us on this call here will be aware of the read and publish deals that are now being negotiated with publishers, where they're now selling us basically the same thing they've always sold us, but giving us a few free, in inverted commas, APCs alongside the subscription costs that we're paying to them. So our data is really giving us, in New Zealand, the first sort of data, the first real understanding of how much our researchers might be contributing to the coffers of publishers outside of the library IR sort of standard subscription processes. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please, Jess. And then this one, I won't say too
Richard,
much about.
sorry, just
Yeah.
before you get onto the slide,
Yep.
Adrian has asked, so how can we change this in New Zealand? Who is the right voice to the New Zealand government to increase / mandate OA publishing of publicly funded research? So, or Jess would like to answer that.
It's not Jess and me or the CONZUL project, I think would be fair to say.
My gosh, come up with
Yeah.
an answer, man.
I mean, if it was up to me, yeah, sure, that'd be easy. But that's a tricky question, you know. So who are the key players? There's the funders, and as Jess has mentioned, that's one avenue that's already being pursued. And so the Office of the Chief Science Advisor has sort of shown some interest in this, possibly because Australia's just started doing it, and we've looked at them and gone, oh, whoops, Australia's doing it, we'd better buck up our game. So that's one avenue. So there's funders, there's our institutions, there's the government more broadly, I suppose, you know, not talking about the funders. Who am I missing? There's the researchers themselves, I suppose, but, you know, so there's lots of different people who might have an idea about it. I think the reason we're presenting it this way is because, we started with impact, is because that's what gets people's attention, really, I think, and how we're missing out on these things. So who can mandate it? I mean, really, the funders, the people providing the money, so either the government or the funders are the people who can mandate it. That's what happened with Plan S, obviously, in Europe and that sort of thing. Jess, did you want to add?
I think you've pretty much nailed it, but the only thing I would add is that there's so many different parts of the research ecosystem. And addressing this problem really requires lots of different units and stakeholders to come together that haven't been traditional partners. And it's definitely easier said than done. I'm not sure you could point to a single, you know, a single body. Certainly we will all be, you know, we'll all be looking for the, what happens with this report with the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. But yeah, I would just say that there's lots of moving parts here that all have to move together in one direction, and that's tricky.
And the publishers use this against us. Our whole sector is, you know, we're institutions, but actually people work within disciplines, and there's cultures in different disciplines about openness that are completely divergent. You know, in genetics, they just put everything out there, and that's expected. You know, they don't license it; they're hopeless at it. But they just put it all there, and it's expected that it's open and everyone just uses it. Whereas, you know, another discipline can have quite a closed attitude. And we've surrendered control of all this stuff to the publishers. That's the key to it. That we have to take back control of it. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and that probably segues nicely into not a question, but a comment that was posted, and that is, this is a great business model for the publishers. Not only are they getting the libraries to pay subscription fees, but now increasingly getting the authors to also pay out of their budgets or personal savings. Talk about double dipping.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we shouldn't just slam publishers, but we're talking about the big ones here, anyways, when we're talking about the people who are getting most of this money. Actually, I'm going to talk about that in a sec, I think, aren't I? So let's move on to, so these are, well, those are just the average prices. Actually, go back, Jess, sorry, I didn't actually really cover the info on that. But you can see hybrid, generally speaking, a lot more expensive. We've sort of talked about the reasons why that might be so, tend to be the higher prestige ones, but also might be the type of publishers that tend to offer hybrid as opposed to gold ones. So gold, the average prices are much less. There's a few signs of a little bit of increase over time there, I guess, too. But these are just useful figures. It's not too much to say about them other than if you're talking to academics about the costs, these are useful figures to have in your head, I think, about the sort of the general things. So next slide then, please, Jess. So then this is showing you of our whole data set. It's all of the publications in there, and there are a handful of books in there as well too. We should mention, actually, we didn't mention that earlier. It's mostly journal articles, but there's some other stuff in there as well. This is all publications, regardless of type, regardless of whether it's open or closed. It's everything, whether it's the New Zealand corresponding author or whatever. That's not shown here. This is every publication in our data set. So, you know, no surprise here. Elsevier, Wiley, Springer, and or Taylor and Francis, as I think of them, Informa, over 50% of the whole. It's around 52 or 53% from memory, is with those big four, and Elsevier clearly out on top. We've just noted one there, MDPI. So people may not know this publisher even particularly, because this is an open access only publisher that's sort of only been around for about 10 years. But then if we go on to the next slide, then Jess, then this is a real data heavy. This is where I was thinking we need a picture of trees just to break people's thoughts up so that they're not looking at numbers all the time. But this one here is directly from our report, which we've got a link to at the end, which is on the CONZUL website. So you can dig into this in more detail if you like, but you've got the 3 columns for the 3 years. And so if you think back to the previous slide where Elsevier was 20% of all the publications, it actually comes in only 4th in terms of the APCs we're paying. So Springer jumps to the top, and you can see we're actually paying over $500,000. This is US dollars on this slide, by the way, because that's the sort of list prices usually in US dollars, and that's what we've used. And that there's been a reasonable increase in these fees in over the 3 years in most of these cases, right? That's the right-hand column, shows you this proportional increase. But what's interesting is when you talk about the money we're paying in APCs, MDPI and Frontiers come in at 2nd and 3rd. So these are OA only publishers. So everything that's published in those journals under those publishers incurs an APC. And that's the gold type. And PLOS is another one. Public Library of Science comes in lower down. So the traditional sort of way of thinking of, or the way we think about the publishers where, you know, Elsevier is going to be top and Wiley and Springer, that is slightly reversed when we're talking about the money we're paying to people. But I would also note a couple of other things before we leave this slide here. If you look at MDPI, in 2017, there were only 139 publications with that publisher. In 2019, that's more than doubled in terms of the volume of publications I'm talking about, as opposed to the cost. The cost has more or less doubled as well, right? That's a pretty large increase with a publisher where, and again, I don't know if you guys have heard about this publisher much, but Jess and I have talked about them a bit. Siobhan, you and I have talked about this publisher a bit. The quality of the journals here gets mixed reviews, it might be fair to say. I've had some researchers tell me, oh, this is a great journal. It's got good stuff, good people writing it. It's a pretty good editorial team or whatever. Whereas other ones, people actually think they almost seem more like they're predatory journals and with poor editorial standards and poor quality research, and it's not really worth publishing in them. But that's come in as the 2nd highest, and on the previous slide was 4% of the total volume of all our publications in any publisher. So that's interesting there, I think. I should probably mention Informa's gone up 896%. I think that might be due to some peculiarities of our data. I wouldn't read too much into that particular one. But you can see, for example, Elsevier has gone up from about $100,000 in 2017 to nearly $300,000. And so they're really pushing their hybrid ones. Most of that increases in the hybrid area with those big publishers. All right.
Richard,
yeah, go for it.
there has been a little bit of a discussion around the read and publish deals and a question about kind of whether they may seem good on the surface, but they are kind of locking academic libraries into OA deals, which enable publishers to increase APCs incrementally. I don't know whether you or Jessica would like to comment on that at this point.
I could say lots of things, probably. Jess, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, just to note that we didn't look at read and publish. It was completely outside the scope of this project, but certainly it has prompted heaps of discussion around the data. And I think there are lots of conversations that need to be had around read and publish agreements, and particularly between people in the library, you know, between people who work in this open access space and also in the procurement space. One thing I would say is that this data is really powerful for informing decisions. And I think that what's key with the read and publish agreements is that we scrutinise particularly this first year where everything's 0% increase, and I really hope that people take this data and use that alongside what we're provided by the publishers. yeah, but there's so much more to say about read and publish agreements, and there are conversations need to be had.
Yeah, and just about that, will read and publish agreements be captured in the future for this data, or will it further hide these costs?
We don't know. I mean, the next year's data will capture 2020, which we only had a couple of pilot agreements in place. So potentially next year's data will be safe. The following year's data will need a serious rethink. So we're going to need all of the people who have touched this project to come back and put their heads together around what the implications would be. Yeah, that's why we're so excited about this 3-year mark, because this might be our last chance to look at this, you know, before read and publish agreements complicate the issue even more.
And we've got subsets of this information for each university, and that's actually we've got a GitHub page with all the spreadsheets in them, so people can actually go and look at the data for their own individual university. It's not the most user-friendly thing to dip your head into a spreadsheet out of the blue without someone explaining what it is, but as we say at the end on the slide, we've got a list of all the people who have worked in this project from the different institutions. Talk to your local person about it. But, you know, for example, you know, I can look at Otago's stuff and see that we've published, you know, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, you know, 150 things with Springer, and, you know, 132 of them were gold and 18 were hybrid, or whatever it might be. So it's really rich down to the level of those sort of numbers. So you actually understand how much you're spending now and what type of publication. So then when you look at the read and publish deal, you can go, oh, so they're offering us 20 or whatever it is, you know, things. Then you know, well, do we need that? Or do we never publish with this publisher? You know, so there's lots of information that can be gleaned with them to evaluate whether those things are actually a good deal or not, I guess. And as Anne has commented in the thing there, the current read and publish agreements are often only the hybrid stuff. So it doesn't help us if with the gold stuff that we're publishing in. All right. Okay, I think that is back to you, Jess.
Okay, so we have a bit of an irony here in that we've actually got the means to fix this. So one of the things we can do with the data is find out what is currently closed that could be made open legally and without payment of an APC. So we do this through publisher policy data from the Sherpa Romeo API. So I know I'm talking in a big picture here, but I think it's useful to take a step back and look at a hypothetical situation of what if we could get all of the authors with a closed article, which was eligible to be made open via the green route, to upload their accepted manuscript to the repository. If we could do that just for 2019 alone, we'd bring our open access proportion up to 70% from 44. So that would be around 4,000 articles for 2019 alone. And then consider if they were to all receive what we've seen to be the average citation advantage of around 50%, not to mention the greater exposure. I think it's interesting to think about how powerful that would be. And then if you extrapolate that out to happening on a multi-year basis, it's just an incredible thought. I don't want to oversimplify this. We need to acknowledge that there's barriers to this. There's reasons that this hasn't, you know, just kind of already happened, and the barriers were not part of the project, but we did mention them as something that needed more attention just about every year. So I think, you know, that's another discussion that needs to be had. It's a complex situation and there's no easy answers, but I also want to point out that the scholarly publishing ecosystem is not an old one. We're talking kind of post-war for journals and publishing business models. And someone did say to me once, like, if we wiped the slate clean and started from scratch, we wouldn't even be talking about journals. So I think we should not lose sight of that. And I just want to mention, to go right back to the start, the Budapest Open Access Initiative, where all of this started. And they stated that an old tradition and a new technology have converged to make possible an unprecedented public good. The old tradition is the willingness of scientists and scholars to publish the fruits of their research in scholarly journals without payment for the sake of inquiry and knowledge. The new technology is the internet. So I feel like, you know, that's, if we look back on where we've come from, it's not too late to rewrite the story and to make it something more positive. So I think we have to think about potential. So I just want to, I know we've mentioned this lots of times now, but this, you know, we've embedded openness into every facet of the work that we've done. You know, we published a preprint, our paper is open access. All of the work you see in terms of this infographic, the presentation, it's all been done in Canva and it's all open to be shared as templates. The data is open, code is open, and it's all really there for people to make use of. These are all of the people that have touched this project in some way over the last 3 years, so I want to acknowledge them. But as Richard said, I also want to encourage people to reach out and talk to those around them, especially if you're curious. And also, you know, Richard and I are here as well for anyone who wants to talk. So we've been really grateful for the opportunity to share this, and I hope it's been useful. And I will unshare my screen and hand over to Siobhan for questions.
Yeah, and well, people, I'm sure there'll be some questions out there. Just while we're waiting for them, I will do a shameless plug to say that at the upcoming LIANZA conference, I believe, Richard, you are facilitating a session on a sector korero on how tertiary libraries work together to support the adoption, adaptation and creation of open education resources.
Yes, apparently I am doing that. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No, that'd be great. And so that's on a slightly different topic, which is on, yeah, sort of teaching resources. But yeah, thanks for the plug.
Yep. So at any rate, there are a couple of things that have just come through on chat. First of all, from Cara, it's not too late to rewrite the story. Great line, Jessica. Okay. The idea of journals makes less and less sense to the younger generations who are used to searching online for discrete pieces of information untethered to a particular location. Yes. Then here is a question from Adrian. Is there any potential to expand this mahi to include polytechnics and PTEs in the future?
And CRIs, Megan's commented directly below that.
Well, and CRIs, yes.
Well, yes, in the sense that the code is there, it's open source. So at a basic level, is you need someone who needs to understand Python a little bit and sort of in how to run a Python script. But basically all you need is a CSV file with a list of DOIs in it. They can be any DOI. So you can, you know, ask people walking past you on the street to give you their DOI and create a list that way. Or you can go to Scopus and you can download all the ones for Department X and Institution Y. Or you can do what we did, which was any one that's associated with any New Zealand university. So there's no limit to the scope of what you can analyze. So we could easily have included CRIs, but they just went within the scope of our brief, or Polytechs or Wānanga. Obviously are outside of the scope of us working in universities, but it's definitely possible. I did see someone at the University of, it's Victoria University in Melbourne, had just picked up the code and done it and run their own analysis and published a blog post saying they'd done it. So, you know, it's there, people can do it. But, you know, I mean, I'm speaking for myself. If people outside the university sector are happy to use it, I'd be very happy to assist in that, sort of outside of the scope of the CONZUL project, perhaps. But, you know, I think we should spread the love as much as possible.
Just on that note, while other people think about whether there's another question, one of the things that my team has done with the code, just to show you, is that we have run it and gone to various departments, particularly where there's a lot to be gained, because as Jess pointed out, there is a substantial amount of stuff that's currently behind a paywall that the embargo period has expired and it can be made immediately openly available in the institutional repository. So we've gone to these departments and we've basically said, look, the code coupled with a couple of other sources of metadata, allows us to basically bulk upload the stuff into our institutional repository, because one of the biggest barriers is often academics just feel they don't have the time to put everything out one piece at a time. So we have been bulk uploading material into our archive using this code as a means to check whether what can be put in and gather the metadata pretty quickly in order to do so. And we've had some pretty good successes. It's by no means perfect. Probably the biggest barrier that we have found is that academics don't really know where they've put their author accepted manuscript. There's a lot of education that has to go around helping them understand what is an author accepted manuscript.
Yeah, they don't necessarily know what it is.
Yeah, to begin with. And then it turns out that they often have not kept any kind of archived copy of the author accepted manuscript. That I would have to say is probably proven the biggest barrier. But it's another example of how you can use this code that's been generously made available. And if anybody ever wants to know about how we manage that in our workflows, I'm more than happy to talk to that. Okay, Cara asks.
Can I?
Oh, go for it, Luckman. Go for it.
I think I've probably butted in enough in the chat, but I do have a sort of question about how we move the conversation. I mean, I haven't looked through obviously everybody's name who's here today, but I'm given that this is a TELSIG event, I'm assuming that the majority of people are engaged in tertiary education in some way, employed through that. And I'm curious to know how just generally what people think about the idea of moving the conversation into different communities, and particularly public libraries, for whom public research is obviously important too, and the important role that repositories can make. And I always think back to a presentation I did a few years ago for LIANZA and think, I really pitched that wrong. I really should have made my talk about why public libraries should be engaging in open access. And so I'm curious to know what you two as presenters, or you as well, Siobhan, think about how we can take this data and present it to our public libraries, but also practitioners in the community, ways in which we can share this message to all of those people that were listed, and all those stakeholders or community groups that Jessica listed in that very first image, but was really striking about these are the people that don't get to access publicly funded research.
Can I just add that there's some synergy with this, with what you've just asked, Luckman, with the question from Cara about, is there any capacity for independent researchers to place their research in an institutional repository in New Zealand? So I think that, yeah, there is some relationship between what you've mentioned and that. So I'll just put both of them to our two presenters.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely time to expand this conversation, because as I think like a lot of the time the conversation gets shut down because people don't understand what it means for a piece of research to be made open to the public. But also I think like it's not just about that, it's also about research translation and knowledge mobilization. So certainly making things open is one thing, but also really working on that relationship, particularly in this environment with the pandemic and that with public trust in science. You know, it's so much bigger than just not paying APCs or research being behind paywalls. So that would be my 2 cents. Yeah.
Just a statement by Judy in the comments. She suggests that you include funders, government researchers and communities, most of whom are the participants in research or the researched in the mahi and talanoa, if they are not already included.
Yeah, we've been working really closely with Tom Saunders, who's the intern who's working on this with the, with the Office of the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. So, yeah, agreed.
Those are difficult conversations to have. I think, because people don't understand how the publishing ecosystem works fundamentally. And like I said way back when we presented the slide that was, this 44% open, and people are like, oh, that's not as bad as I thought. That shows the way people still think. And for those of us who work in tertiary institutions, it's a hidden problem. We've got access to all this stuff, largely speaking. And I think it's, so one thing that interests me from doing this work is we also have a slide that says, these, practitioners, health professionals, policymakers, these people can't access this, but actually quantifying that and what that problem is really difficult. And of course, people, on a sort of a general principle are going to say, oh yeah, that's not very good, is it? But it's hard to actually estimate the damage that does, I think. And so the size of the problem is not really well understood, probably. So, this work is starting to put something sort of more quantifiable or graspable around that sort of idea, I guess.
There's been a bit of conversation happening on chat, but I'm not seeing any specific questions. Are there any further questions from the floor? Okay, well.
Kia ora, sorry, I was just going to jump in, Siobhan. It's Aubrey Kirkpatrick from Victoria University of Wellington. I was just going to say, in response to Lukman's kind of comment about missing out on kind of public libraries engaging with this, I just wanted to highlight myself and Max Sullivan will be doing a session called Open Up about finding open access resources that's aimed at public libraries and for other kind of libraries that are not lucky enough to access all of the services. And we'll be touching on obviously Koki data set as well as the work here to kind of give people that underlying kind of knowledge of what this landscape is like and how they can navigate it, and also promoting the advocate kind of role that may not be as big as we would like it to be, but that we should be trying to champion in all areas of the library. But that's all. Great presentation, guys.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I will take that silence to mean that that we have come to the end of the Q&A at this point. However, knowing Richard and Jessica personally, I can tell you that I'll just speak for you guys, that if people have questions, I'm sure that you'd be more than willing to receive them by email or other means. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. At any rate, I just...
We're just at the end of it, so it's fine.
Just trying to read around.
I think that's just background
Okay,
noise.
yeah.
Thank you for your contribution. Yeah.
Any rate, so just on behalf of the TEL SIG committee and on the LIANZA on the whole, I just want to say a big kia ora to Richard and Jessica. We really appreciate you sharing this mahi, and we're really excited to see what further data comes from it, and also really want to acknowledge the fact that you practice what you preach, for want of a better way of putting it, that you've made everything available openly, and that now us in this community can actually leverage that hard work that you have put in to hopefully move these conversations and actions forward. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us. It's been great.
Kia ora, everyone.
Okay, and so Diana, if you want to stop the recording, and I'll say a big ka kite anō, and thank you everybody, and keep an eye out for our next TEL SIG event, which is going to be a